Welcome to Circular Strategies Podcast, where we have conversations with leaders engaged in the circular economy, those driving the change, the innovation, and most importantly, the impact. Today, we are fortunate to have just such a leader, Savannah Suttle, founder and CEO of Schema and principal at the family offices of Noble Global Ventures. Savannah Suttle is a leading innovator in the world of family enterprise, known for her unique ability to merge organizational design with coaching to help families transform both their interpersonal relationships and their business structures. Through her work, she enables families to remap their internal systems, fostering stronger relationships, greater resilience, and a legacy of impact. Drawing from the circular economy theory, Savannah applies its principles not only to business models, but also to family dynamics, helping families see the value of their interconnectedness, shared responsibility. Well, Savannah, welcome to the Circular Strategies Podcast. It's a delight to have you here.
Thank you so much, Bob. So excited to be here.
I wonder if you would be so kind as to share a little bit about yourself and your journey into this circular economy.
So I'm Savannah Suttle. I am the CEO and founder of Schema. I do family dynamics coaching with family-owned and operated businesses and family offices. I have a background in psychotherapy as well as entrepreneurship, and I help families blend the two of them to transform their structure and processes so that they can maintain resilience and relationship as they innovate toward a better future together. It is so much fun. I've had the pleasure of kind of co-designing with family offices, what does that multi-generational legacy and strategy look like? And what kind of impact are they hoping to make? And through all of that, have really kind of started venturing into the world of sustainability and creating circular economies. One, the sustainability piece being people being more conscious about how they interact with others in the future. And the circular economy piece, because let's be real, I work with business people who are really pragmatic and they like to make money, and that's how you win the game. So it has been so much fun.
It's really an interesting convergence in my mind. I read a little bit about the family offices, and they tend to skew toward a little bit more, social investing. But how are you seeing that intersection happening, and what's driving it?
A lot of it is that if you can go back several generations, waste was, there was a lot of recycling that was happening even before, in terms of metal or wood or biodegradable products, et cetera. But we didn't have this issue of, maybe except for ceramics, right? We didn't have this issue of plastic. And now we've had many decades of plastic collection. We're having to figure out, what do we do about that? It's become so baked into our supply chains. And even just, the level of Amazon packages that show up at my house, that are, and there's plastic, there's cardboard, and Amazon has tried to, really minimize their footprint, but it's still significant in the lives of everyday people. And so I think there's starting to be more of a conscientious awareness of, okay, what are we doing with this? And then how are we as producers, what is our extended producers' responsibility to change how waste is occurring?
This circular economy and the various pieces of it that need to be put together to build an ecosystem is really pervasive. And I think the space you're working in with regard to family offices and what they're trying to do is kind of, it illustrates just how big this needs to be and how many different pieces need to be put together to construct something that drives real impact. I'm curious, what is your view from that portion of the circular economy? What's your view on the circular economy? How do you see it?
I see the circular economy in two different ways. And one of them is just purely structural, right? How are we creating feedback loops within the processes, whether that's within a particular product design, whether that's within commerce, whether that's in the economy, in policy, in the way that we do organizational feedback, saying, hey, did this thing work? Creating feedback loops that allow us to know if we are actually being successful. Right now, we have so many different things that are siloed due to digital architecture, physical architecture, different generational shifts. We're not really creating those feedback loops that allow us to gauge whether our inputs are creating the outputs that we want to see. And we're starting to, I mean, we've come a long way as a species, obviously, with data, and AI will help us kind of get further in that way. But starting to kind of bridge those feedback loops so that we can actually know what kind of impact are we actually making, and then how do we continue to refine, almost like agile project management. So there's a lot of chicken and egg. But how do we refine to create benefits at every turn, right? Or to understand how flow will work. So my brain tends to go in terms of structurally, how are we designing our businesses, our processes, our, the ways that we relate to each other in ways that are beneficial at every turn. The other piece of, how am I viewing the circular economy is in terms of just resilience. Right? Resilience being the ability for a system to continue to maintain equilibrium, right? Or homeostasis, or just, to be able to continue to perpetuate itself with the least amount of force necessary and the least amount of drag on the system. And what I find is that frequently when things are very siloed, this is going to sound kind of jargony, but just bear with me for a second. When we have a lot of different silos in society or in architecture, or there's so much compartmentalization, we have to do a better job of figuring out how to stitch together and integrate those compartments, because if we don't, then they compete. And in nature, when you look at competition, it's really interesting to see how nature will actually try to segment and minimize certain types of competition in order to conserve energy. Competition is just not always the most effective means of being a physical being, physics-wise.
I think those two insights are particularly interesting because when you talk about integration and resilience, it's a mindset shift, right? From competing to collaborating to,
yes,
it's from a scarcity mentality to an abundance mentality. It is, the we have to figure out how to and recognize that there is a bigger pie out there as it pertains to sustainability and the circular economy. And maybe the slice is a little skinnier, but the size of the pie is significantly larger.
Yes.
And does that kind of coincide with what you're kind of thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big proponent of, where there's a will, there's a way. And a lot of times, while I will definitely accept constraints and limitations, there are certain times where it's like, is that actually a constraint, or are you just being mentally lazy right now? And so there's a real joy for me. I feel like the key to genius is having fun and figuring out a way to make money doing it, And so if we can actually apply that level of mental legwork, right, to solutions, instead of just becoming entrenched and saying, oh, you know what, I can't do it. Like, that's just not the kind of ownership mentality that I see being effective in entrepreneurship. That's not the level of persistence and grit and problem solving that has led to success. And so one of the beautiful things that I get to work with these, especially these multi-generational families in business, is that they tend to cultivate these values of, well, let's figure it out. Like, hey, we have to actually design build. This is a problem. And if we kick the can down the road, we're either going to have to deal with it later, or somebody else in our family is going to have to deal with it later. And so right now I'm seeing a lot of people, especially boomers, who are doing estate planning. who are starting to realize as they're trying to pass off even just things like physical objects to their children, and their children are like, I don't have a house, I don't have space for it, I don't want your things. And they're now having to figure out, okay, well, all of these, I don't know, kitschy tokens or icons that I have collected over the years, little figurines that have all this worth, maybe they don't actually have the worth. Maybe people aren't willing to buy them. What's going to happen with them? What is this legacy? So you start seeing kind of this untethering of, oh, not everything that I have, it may be of value to me, but it's not necessarily of value to someone else.
Yeah.
And so one, what do I do with it? And two, what is of value? How do I start to prune, right? Which I think is also very developmentally appropriate. Sorry, I know it's kind of going in a different direction, but when you're growing as a kid, you are just absorbing. It's just consumerism, of information and vocabulary, and you're just soaking it all in. And then you start to hit different points in your life where you start doing neural pruning. And you have to actually, your brain says, okay, actually, I don't need this. Okay, I'm using this more effectively, more often. I want to keep this, want to grow this here. And as you kind of a symbol of maturity is the ability to start saying, okay, now not only do I need to prune again, but how am I pruning in a way that's not just good for future me, but for future others, right? And so I'm starting to see those trends generationally around stuff, around economics, finances, impact, around process, quality of life, around character building, values. And I'm really excited to see those things come about because it's a level of stewardship that I think has been kind of missing over the last few generations.
What seems to be emerging from listening to you is that the future leaders have more of a triple bottom line kind of mindset toward business. Industry needs to do better. It needs to do better in the community. It needs to be more responsible about what it does. And it doesn't necessarily mean it has to hurt profits. And so it brings a lot of innovation to the forefront. Are you witnessing some of that and seeing that in your work?
Certainly, and I would say it's not just the future generations. I'd say some of the older generations are really starting to grasp the need that if in order to adapt and evolve properly according to society these days, you have to really focus on several different dimensions. One, obviously, being profitability. It's just necessary, um, as well as long-term organizational design. How are you going to sustain operationally without creating burnout, right? And then there's also meaning and value. So why are people participating? It kind of gone are the days of, oh, it's just for the money, or it's just about quality of life, or it's just this, that, and the other. Like, yes, people kind of gravitate one way, more so in one direction than others. But you really have to have all three legs of that three-legged stool in order to continue to succeed as a human being in these societies. And as a leader of businesses, you have to really focus on providing that for anybody who works with or for you, because otherwise it's just not going to be sustainable. And so, kind of, I like to think about sustainability, again, not so much just from an environmental perspective, which is where I think it kind of gets segmented off. That's incredibly important. And I think it's a foundation. And I think it's also another little circular feedback loop, and with it, we have so much to learn from nature. I mean, nature has been doing this all along, right? And at the same time, when I look at sustainability, I really look at patterns of resilience over time. How are you able to continue to sustain an ecosystem in a healthy way? When that equilibrium shifts, there will be a new ecosystem. What does that look like? Is that closer to what is needed or what you're wanting, or is it getting further away from it?
You got Darwin, you got all of that in play, right? This adaptability that is necessary. What do you think is driving the impetus for some of this movement that you're witnessing and participating in? What's the impetus behind it?
It's so multifaceted. For some people, it is sheerly that, hey, look, if we don't adapt, we're gonna fall apart, and our business won't be here, and there's a lot of identity tied up in that. For others, it's that they feel a sense of stewardship and responsibility. I was just in Guatemala at the Volcano Summit, where they were looking at innovation in Latin America, and Castillo Hermanos. They're a large scale beverage producer and distributor in LATAM. And they're looking at, okay, how do we actually solve our waste problems? How are we actually collecting and remitting our stuff? How are we training with local populations, working with local governments, et cetera, to make sure we can remediate what we're putting out? And so, this question has historically seems to have fallen toward a lot of more governments or government responsibilities, as opposed to the consumer, right? As opposed to looking at, okay, how there, obviously there's that other piece of the puzzle, which is commercialization and industrialization. And when you start looking at the ways that we're extracting materials and resources from one place and depositing them somewhere else, we kind of disrupt that natural flow of that nature has already provided in terms of a circular economy. I think about the agricultural revolution and how originally, when people were living on their farms, right, they were eating from the farms and then they were pooping on the farms. And that phosphorus was pulled up and then it was put back. And then starting with most of the industrial revolution, when people start moving into the cities and towns, they start getting their food from the countryside and they put their sewage in the city. So now you have an imbalance, right? And so there started to be all of this phosphorus, attempting to gain phosphorus out of other places like bird guano, et cetera. And even though that was just this kind of one mineral element, we start seeing the same thing, and where people are having to utilize geography in order to procure resources here, deposit them somewhere else. But now there's not the same feedback loop that inspires regeneration. So we have to kind of be intentional about manufacturing and integrating and creating that bridge, which means mapping the process and then troubleshooting and solving it.
Well, circle back for me. So, the volcano, you're also participating in the family office forum. You're doing work with a webinar on the 15th, Pound Help, 3 p.m. Do a little commercial for you, 3 p.m. Pacific time. Go to LinkedIn if you're interested, Pound Help. All of that is kind of, again, really on an interesting continuum. And it's almost multi-dimensional what you're working on in this space. Tell me about something or a challenge right now that you're particularly focused on.
Right now, I'm mostly focused on helping multiple generations better understand each other and better collaborate together. One of the main issues I see, whether it's in business, in this great generational transition of wealth, in politics, et cetera, is our inability as I keep saying as a species, and I'll come back to that in a second, but our inability as a species to really start to curate empathy at scale. So if we think about technology and the ways that, we as a species, we're pretty nascent in terms of living in this digital and virtual sphere. And the same river is never stepped in twice. Like the boomers' experience with technology is different than Gen X, is different than millennials, is different than Gen Z, is different than Gen Alpha. And so and when we as humans have started to interact with tech at different ages, our brains are at different developmental stages. And so we are still in this kind of cascading spectrum of how tech has shaped our brains in terms of object permanence, in terms of memory, in terms of how we actually, read and engage facial cues. There are certain things that have shifted more dramatically in the last 50 or so years. And then there are certain things that are still super hard baked, for the last hundreds of thousands of millions, whatever. But as we as a species have started to shift, we have not, this is also the first time where we're really able to see and interact with people globally as quickly, as rapidly, devoid of context. That has a pretty impactful, a lot of impact on how you relate to folks and how you relate to yourself, your own sense of self-concept. And so if we are to actually start connecting, we've already commercially connected many of our supply chains. What we have not effectively done is, even though we have social media and we have email and we have, all this communication, what we have not figured out how to do is to tap into the underlying resilience mechanisms behind relationship in terms of attachment, connection, and tribal knowledge. And the big part of that is simply because there is just not enough time. Relationships, close relationships and intimacy and attachment does not scale the same way sheer communication to the masses does.
One of the things you said there that's really intriguing to me is that all change, including the circular economy, would be hitting people at different developmental levels. And some of the work you're doing in that area has to be applicable to other change, to other things as well. Are you experiencing that?
Oh, absolutely. What ends up happening is that a lot of times these younger generations get really frustrated with the older generations because the older generations have the money, they have the power, they have the experience, they have the "I told you so" or "I know better," cards. And yet they also do not have eyes to see some of the things that are happening digitally, sociologically, developmentally with the younger generations. There's just a disconnect. And so as they are issuing policies, the younger generation gets frustrated and tends to attribute to stubbornness or lack of vision or, people just being selfish and not caring. They tend to say, oh, just boomers just only care about themselves. And it's like, no, boomers don't understand relational scale or population growth the same way that younger generations do, right? Experientially, they know it here, but experientially, they have not dealt with the same pace at the same developmental stages as those of us who grew up with Facebook in high school or earlier, right? So the younger generations have different levels of visibility, different levels of, and different grades of empathy, right? How you present online may be now very different than how you interact with somebody in person or at the grocery store, et cetera. For older generations, it's typically more cohesive. They're going to be who they are, who they are, who they are. Younger generations have learned how to compartmentalize, right? So you have these two very different modes of operating where older generations tend to be a lot more congealed and cohesive in how they relate. They don't want you, if you have something to say to them, just pick up the phone. They want to hear your voice or see your face, show up at my door, not, just come on in, whatever. You need to borrow a cup of sugar, here you go. Younger generations, hey, I just need you to text me. Give me a heads up. I'm working on something else. Da, 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 da. And then they have to sort and organize, how are they actually doing all of their time and managing all of this additional mental load. So
it probably doesn't make sense to either side.
It doesn't.
No.
Because the older generation is just man, I just want to relate to you. Why is this so hard? Or man, younger generations have zero social skills, right? And younger generations are what are you, a dinosaur? We've got stuff to do. And you know what? And you don't even see the mess that's going to come that I'm going to have to be responsible for. So now I have to prep in order to accommodate for your lack of foresight, for your lack of vision. And when I approach you about the things that you're not seeing, and I approach you from an area of concern where I'm saying, hey, I see this issue coming down the pipeline, whether it's sustainability, climate change, plastic waste, or just I don't know, Aunt Bertha's cookbook collection, that I don't want to have to cart around. How are we going to get it from Nebraska to Utah? And I don't want to ship all that stuff. All of the different things, and the older generation is oh, honey, don't worry about it. Oh, don't worry about it. It's all going to sort itself out. And the younger generations are saying, it has sorted itself out naturally in the past, but we as a society have moved beyond that. We actually have to be intentional. We have to take our poop from the cities and put it back in the fields. Otherwise, there's not going to be anything to grow. So this is the time when, for lack of a better term, we have to give a shit strategically.
it's fascinating the space you work in, and it's such a different aspect of the circular kind of economy continuum. But what's one thing about the your job that you wish people understood better? What's typically misunderstood about what you do?
Maybe a good answer to that would be, what is it exactly that I do? So I work with family owned and operated businesses and now family offices and enterprises when family dynamics are impacting operations in a way that they would like to change. I had originally started as a therapist. I had several instances where I have families who would come in, families who worked together. They'd come to my office to work on their communication strategies, and they'd literally leave my office and go right back to their home office where they had cemented their dysfunction into their operating procedures. Well, as a therapist, you can't really touch the business stuff, right? And as a business consultant, I would try to find other people operationally who could go in and help them untangle this stuff. And what I realized is the business consultants didn't want to touch the family dynamics with a 10-foot pole, right? And so what I do is I've created a separate model and ethical framework for how to kind of navigate this very in-between space. It's filled a gap. Yeah. So you really have to understand family systems, right? And how those work almost from an engineering and process or structural architecture perspective, plus how business systems work. Because families tend to organically grow their businesses according to how they've grown their family. You have similar attachment patterns. You have similar relationships to power and authority. You have different delegations. And so you will actually recreate and cement roles for people because it is the most efficient way time-wise. However, it is not resilient in that it does not always allow for maximum personal growth. So how this can play out is, for example, let's say you've got a family where one kid's always the good kid, the other one's always the artist, and the third kid is always kind of the firecracker comedian, but also kind of irresponsible, right? And now you've made your firstborn CEO. You've made the artist kid is now over the marketing department, and the third one is in sales and is always over promising and under delivering, right? And now all of a sudden you've kind of created these different roles that reflect family stuff. So now when you're talking about why did you promise this to this customer, you're not actually talking about the customer order exclusively. You are to a degree, but not exclusively. You're also talking about the levels of irresponsibility that this person exhibited all through high school and childhood, and why can't they just get their act together? And oh my gosh, mom and dad have spent so much money on you, and is this what we get for it?
All of those things collide.
All of those things.
So it seems to me that what you just articulated, what's often misunderstood then, is that they're solving the wrong problem. And what you stood up here, which is incredibly impressive, is something that fills that gap.
Yes.
It's awesome.
Thank you.
One last question for you. I really appreciate your time today. Look into your circular crystal ball and tell us what you see coming, what it means, and what would you use a magic wand to get done first?
What I see coming is, especially, so, today is Wednesday, November 6th, when we're filming this. It's the day after it looks like Trump has won the election. Given the position of the masses looking toward the economy, I really see the desire for stronger economies, stronger baselines in terms of, yes, there is good intention, but how does it measure up, right? So, and then with the working populations, particularly, especially that three-legged stool, right? Is it profitable and does it make sense? Does it make sense operationally? Is it hitting the impacts that we want to achieve? And does it make sense from a burnout perspective? Can we still be effective human beings working in this world? I see those three pillars kind of being the hallmarks that push environmental change of, can we see measurable impacts? And is it going to actually be sustainable short-term and long-term? To that end, I think we're going to start seeing the business world take a stronger stance in saying, okay, if we have to actually pick up our waste, then how do we reduce that waste in the first place? How can we do a paradigm shift of making money on the front end and the back end and midstream, all at different points of the supply chains? And how do we relate to each other in a way that, again, creates those nice feedback loops and doesn't create bottlenecks? So more systems mapping, more collaboration. I also see a lot of conflict coming, unfortunately. And we'll just handle it when it happens. But if I had a magic wand, what I would
do first.
Yeah. Oh, man. If I truly had a magic wand, I would have people do a paradigm shift. If I could just to say that collaboration is possible, and it might take more time up front, but man, you save yourself so much energy and effort and friction and heartache down the line. That good design is really an art form and a love language, not just to yourself, but to humanity.
What a great closing statement. Savannah, thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you,
It was
Bob.
a great conversation. Thank you.